Welcome to The Shudder. I've got a collection of accounts from the Midwest. At least I think Illinois is considered the Midwest. I could be wrong. Someone can correct me on that. I've been wrong before. I think it was 1996 or something like that. Anyway, I found these reports to be interesting, and I hope you do too. Okay, find that bar stool that the leg sticks out too far on and you break your little toe on, and settle in. When I was 14 years old, my family lived in Bellevue, Nebraska. At the time of the occurrence, my father had recently retired from the Air Force Base after 24 years of active duty. This incident was a series of 3 encounters over a 3-day period. A bit of background seems necessary. My girlfriend lived on the next block. Our houses were separated by a field with a stand of trees on the north side. The trees were approximately 20 feet wide and ran to the east of Bellevue Boulevard. On the east side of Bellevue was a heavily forested area that was either a part of or bordered Fontanelle Forest. I would go over to my girlfriend's house and visit until it was time for me to go back home. My curfew was 10 p.m. during the summer. The first incident occurred as I was crossing the field on my way home one night. I was walking in a northwest direction with a thick stand of trees on my right. I heard heavy footfalls and occasional snapping of branches within the trees. Whatever it was paralleling me. When I stopped, it stopped. When I began walking again, it began walking. It was very dark in the field, and I couldn't see anything. After several stops and starts, I became somewhat frightened and ran the rest of the way across the field, climbed over the 4-foot chain-link fence that surrounded our backyard, and ran into the house. The second incident happened the very next night, exactly the same way as the first. The final incident happened on the third night. As I crossed the field, I again heard the heavy footfalls and snapping of small branches within the stand of trees. Except this time, I was not being paralleled. This thing was heading in a southwest direction, which placed it on an intercept course with my northwest direction. I could hear it getting closer, but could not see anything because of the extreme darkness. Near the point of interception, I began to smell a foul odor. The odor was very strong and almost made me gag. By now, the footfalls were very near. I could feel the thing cross in front of me very close, but could not see anything. The footfalls were now on my left. At this point, I became extremely scared and began running across the field. I'm not sure, but I suspect I cleared our 4-foot fence without even touching it. About halfway up the hill to the house, I stopped. I can't explain why I did, but I turned around and saw what had crossed my path. The backyard and a portion of the field was nicely illuminated by a floodlight my father had put out on the back of the house. Standing at the edge of the field next to a clothesline pole was a creature on 2 legs. It was covered in dark brown hair. I estimate the height at about 7 feet. This is based on the clothesline pole being 6 feet, and the creature's head was a good foot above the top of the pole. I was about 50 feet from it, but could not make out any facial features. I recall that there was eye shine, but I can't recall the color. This thing was extremely thick across the chest. The arms hung almost to its knees and were very muscular. We stood there staring at each other for about 10 seconds before I turned and ran into the house. I was completely mortified. I didn't cut through the field to my girlfriend's house after that, because there's no question in my mind that what I saw was a Bigfoot. I'm 30 years old now, but this happened when I was 11. I realize I was young, however, I've thought about this experience many times over the years, and have not been able to explain what I saw that day. I was with 2 other people, one female who was my age at the time, and her brother who was 13 or 14. The 2 of us girls were walking, and he was on a bike. We were on the outskirts of Columbia, Missouri. I'm not sure of the exact location, but I did force my dad to walk the path with me again in the days after, so I'm sure he would remember. The bike path was wooded on both sides. The weather that day was overcast, but since it was the middle of the afternoon, the visibility was fine. We were about 30 yards from where the path opened up to a lake. We were just walking and chatting when suddenly this creature walked out of the left side of the woods. No excessive noise, just a little bit of rustling like a deer was moving around. It crossed the path and into the right side of the woods. No drama, no growling or screaming. It did nothing to spook us. It just quietly and matter-of-factly walked from one side of the woods to the other. It didn't look at us or do anything threatening. It was about 6 to 6.5 feet tall, fairly thin. Lanky is almost the best way to describe it. I would compare it to an Irish wolfhound on 2 legs, without the dog-shaped facial structure. The most striking part to me, and what I remember most clearly, is that the hair was gray, not brown. It was a dirty gray type color. I did not see any facial features distinctly. The gait was long-strided, the arms were longer, and I remember they swung by its sides like in an ape-like manner. The entire encounter was fairly short and unassuming. We saw this creature walk calmly across the path. No one said a word, but we all wheeled around and ran the entire way back to the house. I just remember being genuinely scared. I know I was young, but I know I saw something that I struggle to comprehend or explain even today. I don't know if it was a Bigfoot, but I know what I saw was not just someone trying to scare us. In the summer, when I was 12, our house at the time sat about a block west from some railroad tracks. About half-mile north of my home was the edge of a wooded bottomland called Middle Fork. It ran into the Big Muddy River to the west and has an abandoned railroad bed running west to east just inside the woodline. The edges of Middle Fork was littered with trash, dumped appliances, and other garbage that the garbage service wouldn't pick up. As you travel along the railroad tracks, it becomes raised to a point of about 10 feet at the end where it runs into a field and drops abruptly. Us kids used it as a bicycle/motorcycle trail. One day, nearing dusk, I was riding my bike through the neighborhood and decided to go down the trail. On the trail, you could either go north into the woods or south back into the residential area. As I was turning into the path, a pair of kids came out on their motorcycle. As they passed, the driver yelled, "There's a hobo chasing us," and they continued on. There was a hobo village nearby, but it was on the east side of the tracks and farther north, and I had never been bothered by them before, so I figured the kids were just messing with me. I had heard reports of the big muddy monster prior, but didn't give it a lot of thought at the time. I turned onto the trail and went west, toward the field, wanting to make a circle back to the residential area. At about midpoint on the trail, which is about 6 feet above the ground on either side, I approached a place where some washers and dryers had been dumped. Behind one of the washers, which was on its side, I could see the outline of a person. When I stopped, this person stood up and was level, looking me in the eye from about 20 feet away. I could make out the outline and see that it was covered in hair. There was a slight breeze and I could see the hair moving somewhat in the wind. The sun was to its back and cast a shadow on its face, but I could make out the shine in its eyes. I could tell where the nose and lips were, but not with any great detail. I don't remember seeing any ears, and I didn't smell anything. It was broad-built, what I could see, and the arms were long. It had a small head, but I couldn't tell if its head was upright or slightly down. When it stood up, it reached with its right hand and grabbed a sapling near it. As it grabbed the tree, it grunted slightly, like in disgust, not mean or angry, and then shook the tree. It didn't shake it vigorously, but it shook it easy enough. With that, I turned back east and took off with all I had. As I exited the trail nearing a road, I slowed down and turned to look back. The creature had walked up onto the trail and looked at me. Then it turned and walked back into the tree line, and I took off home. After telling my friends, they all thought I was nuts. That is, until they started to hear of other accounts, both prior to mine and after. Then nothing more was ever said. I went back to that area a few years later, and back to the spot of the sighting. I'm 6 foot tall, and using the surrounding trees, estimated the creature's height at least 8 feet. I was out late one night catfishing at Clinton Lake by myself. I had been there for probably a couple of hours and hadn't really been catching much. I had talked to a few people who were coming in on boats and saw a few going out. It seemed like a normal night for the most part. About an hour after I had seen the last person leave, I was starting to get the feeling I was being watched. I shrugged it off because I know there are raccoons, possums, coyotes, even stray dogs and cats, so I dismissed it and resumed fishing. After a while, I began to notice how quiet it was. All I could hear was the faint breeze and the water lapping on the boat ramp where I was sitting. Right about then, I started to get spooked. I know when there's a predator of some kind around that this usually happens. I'm an avid duck hunter and die-hard catfisherman, so I'm used to traipsing around in the dark. I figure it's just a coyote eyeballing me, so I got my flashlight and stood up to take a look around. I looked around, but didn't see anything. I once again put this out of my head, starting to think I'm losing my mind. A little while later, again, I noticed the distinct absence of any sound at all. As I'm sitting there, staring across the lake, the hair on my arms and neck starts to stand up. I don't really spook that easy, but when the hair stands up, something is watching you. I decided that I had had all I could stand, threw all my stuff in my truck, and left. On my way home, I called my dad and told him what was going on. He told me that back in the 70s, there were sightings of what the town called the Salt Creek Monster. Now, I'm no skeptic, but at the same time, I've never seen anything like that. After a while, he tells me I should go back and check the place out a little more closely. I decided it was probably a good idea, just for some peace of mind. So I drove back out to the boat launch and parked in the parking lot. I had the truck lights on, as well as my flashlight, and I was scanning the area. After about 15 minutes, I gave up and went to leave. As I turned around in the parking lot, the truck lights picked up something standing in the trees. I immediately stomped the brakes. About 20 yards away, I'm looking at something that's probably 7 feet tall, not overly muscular, but it was covered in black hair. It also had a big pair of yellow eyes. It had a deer in the headlights kind of look about it at first, but then it tore off running through the trees along the lake. I had been in track in high school, and this easily outpaced the fastest runners I've ever seen. When it ran, it didn't pump its arms. They just swayed a bit. Before I really understood what I was seeing, it was gone. Suddenly, I felt I needed to do the same, so I drove my little truck as fast as I could all the way home. I called my dad back and remember being on the verge of panic. He got me calmed down, and I told him what I had seen out there. He had that sound in his voice like he was surprised but still expected it. It's the reason he had me go back, though I held no illusions about actually seeing anything. It was a strange night and an odd experience. After that, I always have my gun in the truck when I'm fishing. Well, I hope you enjoyed those Midwest Bigfoot encounters. I'll be telling the stories by region, so be looking for Pac West, Southeast, South, and so on. It's just taking me a little bit longer putting them together because I'm trying to find some of the more interesting reports. If you've had an encounter or a sighting and you'd like to send it in, it doesn't matter if you send it in somewhere else. The more exposure your sighting has, the more good it's going to be to others. So by all means, send it in and I'll do my best in telling it. Okay, well, I enjoyed telling these, and if you enjoyed hearing them, consider hitting that like button. And if you subscribe, make sure you hit that notification bell so you can join me here next time for The Shudder.